I run the foreign policy programs here at the New America Foundation. I want to say hello to the people watching online on various websites, including the Washington Monthly, the New America Foundation's website, and of course the Washington Note, which I run. Today we're pleased to not only launch I think we're in the third, what we call Big Ideas Initiative of the New America Foundation. The first was with Cheryl Schweninger, who gave his thinking on an economic recovery plan for the United States. It involved a serious new look at infrastructure. Our second was with Lisa Marginelli, who was looking at energy security and families and had some bold ideas there. All of these are at the New America website under newamerica.net/big ideas. And now our third, which is not a new idea because I've been talking to Flynt and Hillary Mann Leverett about this for some time, is on a grand bargain in the region. But I think it's taken on new salience, both as we look forward at the next administration coming in and how the next President of the United States will sculpt foreign policy and national security strategy, and also because it just seems like everything needs to be rethought, and so big ideas are what we're supposed to do. We're proud, very proud, to be partnering with the Washington Monthly magazine in a series of articles that they have here today. The Stakes 2008, the Washington Monthly is co-sponsoring today's program. Where's Paul Glastris, the editor in the very back? I want to thank Paul for the support. The article, The Grand Bargain by Hillary Mann Leverett and Flynt Leverett, which I've posted on the website, goes on and accompanies this is the accompanying piece with today's program. There's also a really great video clip of Flynt and Hillary Leverett on the New America website as well as on my blog with a 4-minute primer on this subject if folks would like to take a look at that. Let me tell you about Flynt and Hillary Leverett. Flynt, of course, is my colleague here at the New America Foundation and directs our Geopolitics of Energy initiative. But he's smart on just about everything, and so is his wife. But I'm talking about them as a distinct pair here, or separately. Hillary Mann Leverett was involved with many of the Bush administration's initiatives and encounters with Iran, with various Ambassador Khalilzad, Ryan Crocker, and others, and has been right in the sort of deep nerve cell of lots of behind-the-scenes deal-making that was attempted and was going on and actually succeeded in many key ways with Iran during the Bush administration. She was both at the State Department and at the Bush administration's National Security Council, where she met her now husband, Flynt Leverett, who is previously with the CIA, previously with the State Department, and he was the Middle East Desk Director at the Senior Director for Middle East at the National Security Council staff under the Bush administration up until 2003. And I'm going to excuse me here. I have some rambunctious colleagues in the back. And I am a great fan of Flynt's and Hillary's work, and I'll share that with you. But I do want to share something with you about them, a different kind of anecdote. This issue of whether Iran is a rational actor or not is about one of the most important subjects that I think this country needs to wrestle with. If Iran is a reckless, rogue, completely irrational about its interests and not able to think, given various parameters of discussion, then it's useless, I think, to have the kinds of programs we are today. If one can make a case based on empirical evidence upon other sort of negotiations and deal-making, that in fact the leadership of Iran has repeatedly acted in a strategically cautious and strategically utility-maximizing way, then there should be far more discussion than we're generally having today about how to affect that change. And one of the things I was most impressed with by both Hillary and Flynt was both their patriotism and their ethic of service, but also their commitment to do the right thing. And you may remember, it was about a year and a half ago, there was an op-ed that ran in the New York Times on Iran's proposal of a normalization deal with the United States. And this proposal was done in all sorts of cloak and dagger ways. You know, a non-paper paper. People were trying to intermediate in sort of an effort to see if the United States would be willing, just after its invasion, very successful invasion of Iraq, to try to test the waters. Iran was scared about its circumstances, knew that it was sort of next on the list of a lot of those who had helped animate the Iraq invasion. There were serious motivations there. And it was fascinating to watch back. If anybody wants to do a fascinating PhD thesis, go back and look at the chronology of the commentary about this supposed so-called initiative from Iran. There was a point where knowledgeable, thoughtful people at other institutions in this town completely denied that such an effort ever took place, that it was a figment of the imagination of various players, and that Flynt Leverett had been duped. Over time, more and more came out of it to see, in fact, that this was a very real part. So real, in fact, that the CIA worked very hard the CIA Publications Review Board worked in a very odd way, sort of after the fact, after the data had already been put out, to try to reclassify, if you will, or to prevent Flynt and Hillary from releasing what they knew about this subject in a short 1,000-word op-ed that was based upon a 30-page paper that had already been cleared, sponsored by the Century Foundation at that time. So I remember being one of those that encouraged Flynt to go ahead with the piece, but with the redacted lines annotated so that people could find the original sources of what was beneath those redacted lines that were not cleared. And it was fascinating that they played by the rules that they were told they needed to as former cleared senior government officials, but they were also very committed to the public truth and sort of knowing that, and I want to commend both of them for that. So without further ado, please welcome Flynt Leverett, who I think will help set the stage, and then we'll have Hillary as well, and then I will moderate a discussion afterward. Flynt Leverett.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks to all of my colleagues here at New America for putting this on, and thanks to the Washington Monthly for allowing us the chance to publish a slightly shorter, not all that much shorter, but slightly shorter, slightly reconfigured version of our longer piece for the Big Ideas series, but to publish that piece in Washington Monthly and hopefully get to a much bigger audience through that venue. And thanks to all of you for coming out. I always like to say that Hillary is the main reason that I can never really regret my service in the Bush administration, because I met her, courted her, and married her while we were both serving at the National Security Council. But the intersection between our professional and personal lives got even more acute with this piece. To wit, about 11 days ago, Hillary gave birth to our new son. And thank you. His name is Matthew. He's doing very well. And so we, of course, had finished the Big Idea draft. We were anticipating a rollout event sometime in early October. And then I get this very nice email from Paul Glastris at the Washington Monthly saying, you know, he'd seen the piece that we had done on Iran, wanted to put it into the magazine. The only catch was this was the October issue. They were getting ready to go to print in about 5 minutes. And, you know, could we, you know, how quickly could we turn something around? And I got this email literally on the day that we are going to the hospital to have Matthew. And so I send a note back to Paul on my BlackBerry saying, we'd love to work with you on this, but you know, you'll have to work with us under some unusual circumstances. But they were very accommodating to our special needs, and we were able to get a text ready for the magazine in time for it to go to print. So that was a very productive week for us. And hopefully, we know our son's a big success. We hope the article comes out, has a good reception too. Clearly, Iran has emerged as a major foreign policy challenge for the next U.S. president, whether it is Senator McCain or Senator Obama. And our argument, in a nutshell, is that the next president of the United States, whoever he is, needs to reorient American policy toward the Islamic Republic of Iran as fundamentally as President Nixon reoriented American policy toward the People's Republic of China in the early 1970s. That argument takes as its starting point what we think is really an undeniable reality, and that is that what we've been doing in our Iran policy for almost 30 years is not working by virtually any definition of working that you would care to employ. Since the Reagan administration, all U.S. administrations have pursued a combination of three things in their policy towards the Islamic Republic of Iran. One is diplomatic isolation. We don't have relations with Iran. We try and discourage other countries from having relations with Iran. Secondly, economic pressure. We impose all kinds of unilateral economic sanctions on Iran, sanctions flowing from their designation as a state sponsor of terror, sanctions flowing from various executive orders that various presidents have imposed. And more recently, we're trying to put pressure on Iran through multilateral sanctions authorized by the UN Security Council. And then the third element of U.S. policy is what I would describe as thinly veiled support for regime change in Tehran. And even when, over the last year or so, Secretary Rice has occasionally said that regime change is not U.S. policy toward Iran, it is very striking that whenever President Bush is asked on a follow-up, is that right? When the Secretary of State says this is an American policy, is that correct? He has on three occasions, which I'm aware, refused to answer the question. Refused to say that yes, when the Secretary of State says this is policy, that is an authoritative statement of U.S. policy. And I think it is still fair to say that thinly veiled support for regime change is an element of U.S. policy toward Iran. Well, that mixture of policies has not worked, even in its own terms. It has not worked. Iran is not diplomatically isolated. In fact, its diplomatic relations have expanded dramatically during this period. This approach has not worked, I would argue, to advance U.S. interests in the region. Indeed, this approach has hurt the interests of the United States and its allies. And U.S. Iranian tensions are now a source not just of regional instability, but they're also a source of danger for global energy security. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But in making our argument for fundamental reorientation of America's Iran policy, Hillary and I go beyond what we see as the failure of established approaches to highlight another critical reality, that Iran is an increasingly important and strategically influential country. Iran's influence is growing in a number of critical regional arenas. I would argue that at this point, the United States simply cannot achieve any of its major goals in the Middle East without a better relationship with the Islamic Republic of Iran. In the past, we have had administrations try to reach out to Iran, try to pursue various kinds of tactical cooperation with Iran. Hillary will talk a little bit about that. But for too long, we've seen the idea of an improved relationship with Iran as falling into the nice-to-have category. Nice to have it if you can get it, but you don't really have to have it. Well, for the next American president, a better relationship with Iran, I would argue, falls into the must-have category. The next president will simply not be able to achieve most American goals of importance in the Middle East without it. I think that argument is augmented when you look at it at U.S.-Iranian relations from a perspective of energy security. Iran has the second largest proven reserves of conventional crude oil in the world. It has the world's second largest proven reserves of natural gas. It is producing well below its potential in both of those arenas. And U.S. policy says essentially that from the perspective of the United States, the world's second largest proven reserves of conventional crude oil and second largest proven reserves of natural gas should stay in the ground until Washington decides otherwise for reasons that will have nothing to do with the global energy balance. Now, in the past, that kind of policy might have been bearable, I think pretty short-sighted, but bearable. In today's energy world, and the energy world we are going to continue to live in for the foreseeable future, that posture is profoundly irresponsible. And that, too, is another reason that the United States needs a different and better relationship with Iran. So all that leads us to argue for a fundamental change in American policy. But by fundamental change, we don't mean incremental step-by-step engagement with Iran, and we don't mean simply trying to manage the Iranian challenge more adroitly than the Bush administration has done. Rather, we mean the pursuit of thoroughgoing strategic rapprochement between the United States and the Islamic Republic, and for us, such rapprochement would be most effectively embodied in the negotiation of a U.S. Iranian Grand Bargain. A Grand Bargain approach means you put all of the major bilateral differences between the United States and Iran on the table at the same time, and you resolve them as a package. For Iran, this would mean Tehran would have to address U.S. concerns about the Islamic Republic's pursuit of weapons of mass destruction, its support for terrorist organizations, its opposition to a negotiated settlement of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and its role in Iraq and Afghanistan. For the United States, this would mean clarifying our willingness to have normal relations with the Islamic Republic of Iran and recognizing a legitimate regional and international role for Iran. In particular, this would mean the extension of a U.S. security assurance to Iran, effectively a U.S. commitment not to use force to change the borders or form of government of the Islamic Republic. That's the deal, that's the package, that is the core of a grand bargain. And Hillary and I argue in our paper that it is really the only way in which U.S.-Iranian relations are going to improve on the watch of the next president. And so with that, I'm going to let Hillary take you through a little bit of the history of U.S.-Iranian diplomacy and also offer some of our thoughts on why more incremental or gradualist approaches, in our view, aren't going to work.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. Thank you, Steve Clemens, for providing what I think has got to be the #1 intellectual home in Washington for people with realist ideas, or potentially the radical center, as it's often called. Been to a lot of different think tanks, and this clearly is an intellectual home where ideas such as this on the Grand Bargain with Iran, but several other ideas, are able to really take root, flourish, and be put out, I think, in a useful way for candidates, for people who are serious about foreign policy, regardless of their political base. Thank you to the New America Foundation. Thank you also to the Washington Monthly for helping us put out and put together this idea. I'd also like to start my comments today taking from what Steve pointed out in our introduction, this question about whether Iran is a rational state and how that really needs to be addressed. From our perspective, too many U.S. politicians and commentators view Iran's government as immature, ideologically driven, and incapable of conceptualizing Iran's foreign policy in terms of national interest. Indeed, apocalyptic scenarios about a millennially inclined Iran, or Iran's leadership, using nuclear weapons against Israel with no regard for the consequences, see the Islamic Republic aspiring to become history's first suicide nation. But the Islamic Republic has for many years shown itself capable of acting instrumentally, in instrumentally rational ways to defend and advance its own interests. As Americans, we may not like some, indeed many or most, of the strategic and tactical choices that Iran has made in pursuing its national security and foreign policy interests. For example, its extensive links to political factions and their associated armed militias in Iraq. Similarly, in Afghanistan, support for terrorist groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, Iran's pursuit of nuclear fuel cycle capabilities that would give Tehran at least a nuclear weapons option. These choices work against U.S. interests across the board. They often antagonize our sensibilities, and rightfully so. They are not, however, irrational, particularly in the face of what Iran sees as deep and continuing hostility from its neighbors, as well as the United States, to the Iranian Revolution and the political order it generated. While much of our policy debate in the United States about Iran doesn't reflect it, we actually have a 20-year history of periodic cooperation with the Islamic Republic on particular issues. The cooperation ran both ways. It wasn't just the U.S. reaching out to Iran. It was Iran acting in instrumentally rational ways for its national security, its state interest, to cooperate with the United States where it would advance its own core security interests. The first Bush administration, for example, worked with Iran to free the last American hostages in Lebanon. The Clinton administration indirectly cooperated with Iran to supply arms to Bosnian Muslims in the mid-1990s. And even the current Bush administration cooperated with Iran over Afghanistan and al-Qaeda, both before and after the 9/11 attacks. I myself participated in nearly 2 years of regular negotiations, monthly meetings with Iranian officials, along with Ambassador Ryan Crocker, from 2001 to 2003, to coordinate our policy to cooperate with the Iranians over Afghanistan and al-Qaeda. In each of these cases, Iran did much, not all, but much of what it was asked. However, successive U.S. administrations terminated their issue-specific cooperation with Iran, primarily because of concerns about domestic political blowback here in the United States, or in the case of the Bush administration, concern about the blowback as well as ideological antagonism toward the Islamic Republic, of course, a charter member of President Bush's axis of evil. A number of Iranian officials, reflecting a variety of political perspectives and occupying a range of positions during the Rafsanjani, Khatami, and Ahmadinejad presidencies, have told us that they anticipated that Iran's tactical cooperation would lead to a broader strategic opening between the Islamic Republic and the United States. They were wrong. In fact, the repeated aborted tactical cooperation between the United States and the Islamic Republic in the absence of a broader strategic understanding has led the U.S. and Iran closer to conflict periodically after each one of these episodes of cooperation. So you can look back in terms of the Clinton administration in Bosnia, 1996. Right after that, you had the 1996 Khobar Towers bombing. 2001 to 2003, the cooperation over Afghanistan and al-Qaeda. Then we come close to conflict, of course, in the past couple of years here. Based on my experience dealing with the Iranians, I don't believe at this point that yet another try at incremental engagement is going to put U.S.-Iranian relations on a fundamentally different or better trajectory. Détente, an effort to manage tensions along the lines of U.S.-Soviet relations during the Cold War, also will not work for at least 3 reasons. First, while the U.S. and the Soviets were roughly at parity in their military capabilities, the U.S. is and will remain vastly superior to Iran in every category of military power, conventional or otherwise. Therefore, without a broader strategic understanding, Iran will have to assume and act as if the U.S. is out to destroy the Islamic Republic. It sees no other way. Second, in an atmosphere of ongoing uncertainty about America's ultimate intentions toward the Islamic Republic, Iranian leaders will continue working to defend their core security interests in ways that are guaranteed to be maximally provocative to the United States, guaranteed. Third, U.S.-Iranian détente wouldn't forestall the increasingly serious costs that it will accrue to America's strategic position in the absence of more fundamental improvement in U.S.-Iranian relations. As Flynt pointed out, the next U.S. administration will not be able to achieve any of its high-profile policy goals in the Middle East, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, the Arab-Israeli arena, or with regard to energy security, without putting U.S.-Iranian relations on a more positive trajectory. That requires much more than U.S.-Iranian détente. The only approach that can actually resolve the outstanding issues between the U.S. and the Islamic Republic of Iran is a grand bargain approach. It's the only approach that can resolve the issues because it is the only approach that seeks to do so. Détente does not seek to resolve the issues, it seeks to manage the issues. Incremental engagement does not seek to resolve the issues, it seeks to build some sort of mysterious confidence that somehow over time we will overcome our confidence problem and maybe get to talk about issues. It doesn't seek to resolve them. The only approach that seeks to resolve the issues between the Islamic Republic and the United States is a grand bargain, and that's the only way we can do it. Thanks for your attention.
Just before we go to the discussion, I thought it would also, I'll just take a couple minutes and walk you through what we see as the key elements of a grand bargain. I think, as I said, the notion is putting all of the main issues on the table and trying to resolve them as a package. We think that this approach needs to start with the definition of a strategic framework for improving relations between the U.S. and Iran, kind of an analog to the Shanghai Communique for U.S.-China relations in the 1970s. And as I said, I think this framework would need to address at least three sets of issues. First, U.S. security interests, including stopping what we see as Iran's pursuit of WMD, support for terrorism, opposition to negotiated settlement of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the problematic aspects of its role in Iraq and Afghanistan. Clearly, we'd have to address Iran's security interests, including extending U.S. security assurances to the Islamic Republic, lifting unilateral U.S. and multilateral sanctions against Iran, and acknowledging the Islamic Republic's place in the regional and international order. And then third, there would need to be a commitment to developing a cooperative approach to regional security. In the article and the longer paper published by New America, we walk through, under each of those three headings, what would be required of the two sides, what it would mean for Iran to take seriously addressing U.S. security interests, what it would mean for the U.S. to take seriously addressing Iranian security interests, and what it would mean for both sides to start taking a genuinely cooperative approach to regional security. So I would encourage you, obviously, to read the article, read the longer paper, and we walk through that in a great deal of detail. But I think at this point, we'll go on to the discussion.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Let me open the discussion. I want to open the floor, and I see a lot of hands. I'll go first to Spencer Ackerman, but before that, why don't we get a microphone over to him? But let me just pose this one question. It's hard when you think back to Nixon and Kissinger. You know, Nixon pre-Kissinger, wanted to be president of the United States in 1960. He wanted to be president when he felt as if American power was robust, and he wanted to sculpt national security strategy in that time. And what he got when he got to the presidency, finally, was a time where American power was perceived to be in decline. And it's remarkably similar to today, where I think in the beginning of the Bush administration there was a feeling that America was ascending. Today I think there's a big perception of a descending, much less robust power and capacity in the world. Iran, you both used to say, has become more hardened in its position, particularly given its sense of weakness in the United States, but I also see oil declining. And oil is at least one of the contributing factors to Iranian strength. So when you've got both powers somewhat diminishing in power and their ability to project power or project confidently power, do you think that's a better environment for your deal than it would be if the United States and Iran were in stronger position?
I think the key is, and this is obviously part of what was at play with Nixon, is you have to have a president on the American side who is willing to say, who's willing to look at American strategic interests and look at America's place in the world in a very cold-eyed and sober way. And if that assessment leads him to this conclusion, to be willing to say, what we've been doing with this critical country for a quarter century, for Nixon it was the People's Republic of China, what we have been doing in our policy toward this critical country for a quarter century is not working. American interests and America's strategic position are suffering as a result. I want something that works, and I am prepared to manage whatever domestic political blowback comes, because this is critical for American interests. if this is going to work. I think I'd probably agree with you that it actually perhaps, you might, look at a situation over the next 2 or 3 years in which the case for each side to make this move would seem even more compelling.
Yeah.
But you're going to have an occupant of the Oval Office who's really prepared to understand American interests in a profound way, act on them, and manage the domestic
Thanks.
political blowback.
Spencer Ackerman. Oh, yeah, sure. Okay. Yeah.
Just from the Iranian side,
Sure.
because I think it is very interesting. You mentioned the drop in oil, and potentially with an economic downturn worldwide, you could even foresee a significant drop in potential oil demand, which could affect Iran's calculus, I think, as you posit. But we have 4 episodes where the Iranians entered into tactical cooperation. We have essentially the 85-86 period during Iran-Contra. We have the 90-91 period in the first George Bush administration over getting the hostages out of Lebanon. We have the 94-95 period where the Clinton administration indirectly cooperated to arm the Muslims in Bosnia. And we have the 2001-2003 period over Afghanistan and al-Qaeda. In each one of those cases, Iran was going through various tumults of domestic change. They went from presidency to presidency. This spans going from Rafsanjani to Khatami to Ahmadinejad. And you have various positions of economic power or disorder inside the Islamic Republic. And of course, you have some of these occasions happening when Iran was in the midst of war, being attacked with chemical weapons by Iraq. I think for the Iranians, you will find, certainly in our negotiations with the Iranians, some of the very negotiators that Ryan Crocker and I met with also participated in the prior rounds of negotiations and tactical cooperation with the U.S. For them, the strategic imperative of a broader understanding with the United States was something that had become a permanent feature, gradually increasing, but still a permanent feature for what Iran was looking at and in its foreign policy since the death of Ayatollah Khomeini. And that is something that, though it's been gradual and certainly very imperfect from their side, of course, otherwise we might have a grand bargain, it still has been something that key people in the foreign ministry in particular, but you can take it in terms of Iran's National Security Council, have looked at as a goal. Now, I think what has happened in terms of the different time elements, and we may see it now, is the price that they're willing to pay for a grand bargain goes up or down. But the strategic imperative of having a broader strategic understanding with the United States is something that, for many of them, and people from in the Foreign Ministry, the National Security Council, even some people in the Revolutionary Guard that we've met with, they still see it as critical for the next generation of Iran to have a broader strategic understanding with the United States.
Thanks. Spencer Ackerman with the Washington Independent.
Thanks very much. This goes directly to what you were just saying, Hillary. First of all, you talk about the U.S. would need in a grand bargain to recognize a legitimate role for Iran strategically in the region. Could you flesh out what that would mean? Because I would imagine that would have a great deal of implication for whether either the price is too high for the United States or acceptable to the Iranians. And second of all, could you explain, even if you believe that key people in the Foreign Ministry and the Revolutionary Guard and so forth believe this to be a permanent fixture, is that sufficient to force a government under Ahmadinejad to take that sort of grand bargain as well? Or, forgive me if I'm misstating his relationship with the Foreign Ministry, is that a confidence you see on the part of the political leadership in Iran as well?
I think for Iran's role in the region, we focus, I think, most frequently on the antagonism between Iran and Israel and Iran and the United States. And certainly those are two problematic countries for Iran, the U.S. and Israel. But in the negotiations that I had with the Iranians, what came out most often, was their problematic relationships with Pakistan, with Saudi Arabia. They would often refer to their 15, not only hostile neighbors, but the 15 neighbors that they saw as strategic adversaries. They don't have a single neighbor, not even Syria, that they could look at as a strategic partner, that they see everyone in their neighborhood as a strategic adversary. But they have no place to go. They're not only a large country, they're strategically pivotal in terms of the Central Asia and the Middle East, of course, in terms of hydrocarbon resources, that they are going to be a big player no matter what, for either good or bad, for their own benefit or their own detriment. So what they would say to us in the talks is that they not only need to figure out a way to exist in the region with these 15 strategic adversaries, as they would put it, that's a critical foreign policy goal of theirs. But to achieve that, not only do they have to figure out a way to do it just in the region, they need the U.S. to take away, essentially, the sword above their head, that at any time their government could be undermined or brought down by either a quiet velvet revolution promoted by the United States or something even more militaristic in terms of a threat to them. Because of the constant threat that the U.S. has either implicitly or directly placed on them, they not only see a problem vis-a-vis the U.S. threat, but that threat then enabled these 15 strategic adversaries to be much more provocative and antagonistic toward Iran than they would be if the U.S. and Iran were working together. So, for example, for the Saudis or the Pakistanis, two of the countries that they would cite most frequently as problematic for them, they often thought that if there was a deal with the United States, a strategic understanding with the U.S., Pakistan and Saudi Arabia would be far less provocative toward them. Then in terms of the factions within Iran, people often dismiss the foreign ministry or foreign ministry officials, diplomats there, as somehow pinstripe suits that have no power in Iran. They never wear a suit. And they do have a power in Iran. They have a power of both a process, and in terms of the National Security Council, they do have a voice. But even more so, I think a lot of the power centers in Iran are not just by your office, but by who you are, who you're related to by marriage, who your uncle is, who your brother is, who your brother-in-law is. And so several people that may technically have a position in the foreign ministry also have very powerful family members who either work in the Supreme Leader's office, who are with the Revolutionary Guard, or others. There's a lot of kind of cross-fertilization among the factions. I don't think it's accurate or useful to characterize one or more of the power centers in Iran as completely decisive. Each of them has a role. Each of them influences the other power centers. And there's I think there's an up and down. One of the founders of the Revolutionary Guard that we met with is someone who I think has been sympathetic to some of Ahmadinejad's policies, but is also a direct competitor. And we may see him running for president in the next election against Ahmadinejad. So you have a lot of these kind of dynamics going on.
Who is this guy?
This particular person
Is he the mayor of Tehran, or a different guy?
No, this is a different person.
You want to put
As
his
a
name
rule,
out
I'd
there?
rather not get
Okay.
into the particular
Just
names
thought I'd make news.
of the Iranians, but if
Let
it's
me get
really
some other
necessary.
questions if I can. Let me get some other. Alan Gerson. Yeah, there's Mike racing towards you.
There's an additional element, it seems to me, in the Grand Bargain that has not been mentioned, but it's an element that I believe the Iranians mention anytime they have a negotiation with the United States, and that is the role of the PMOI or MEK, which they label as terrorists. And as I understand it, they have two demands. The first is that the United States government not follow the lead of the UK, which has taken the PMOI off the list, saying that they have renounced terrorism and that there's no basis for keeping them on the list, and insisting that the United States do this as a political rather than legal matter. And then more pressing as a humanitarian issue is the fate of the nearly 4,000 people associated with the PMOI in Camp Ashraf. The Iranians say that they would like to see them repatriated to Iran. There was an article in yesterday's Washington Times that said that would be the equivalent of an American Abu Ghraib. So how would you have us deal with that factor?
So, MEK?
In our talks with the Iranians, they brought up the MEK as almost a tit for tat with the United States. They felt, and I think legitimately, saw that they had been helpful on al-Qaeda. And President Bush had said repeatedly that there is no good terrorist or terrorist organization. And we, Ryan Crocker and I, repeatedly told them that that was U.S. policy, that there was no good U.S. terrorist organization. That was U.S. policy at the time. That is still U.S. policy today. It was U.S. policy at the time with the invasion of Iraq that the MEK would be considered a wholly owned subsidiary of Saddam's army, because that's how the uniformed military at the Pentagon saw it, and were going to pursue it. That's what we were told, and that's what we told the Iranians. There were some people in the administration.
So just to clarify, our government saw the MEK as a subsidiary of Saddam's outfit.
At the time,
I see.
yes. The uniformed military, that was part of the planning for the invasion, was that the MEK at the time was seen as armed and supplied by Saddam Hussein and part of the military, and therefore would be essentially on the target list. There were some in the administration on the civilian side at the Pentagon, in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, who thought that even though that was U.S. policy, even though that was the case, that the MEK could at a later time be useful to the United States, assuming that we would be victorious, quickly victorious in Iraq, that the MEK could then be used as a forward operations group, essentially, to go into Iran for various purposes. They did so even when the Iraqi government wanted to talk to the Iranians about this issue and actually negotiate with the Iranians what to do with the MEK, because in the end we didn't bomb the MEK sites. The MEK was basically left in Iraq. And instead of allowing the Iraqi government to talk to the Iranians about it, we declared them protected persons, which meant that the Iraqi government could not repatriate or do anything about these MEK fighters in Iraq. The Iranians, the next step the Iranians had was, why don't we work with the ICRC, let the International Red Cross work with us to figure out a way to deal with the kind of top commanders of the MEK who may have been directly involved in any kind of terrorist activity on Iranians, and then deal with the rest of the group as kind of a poor group of people who had really been sucked into an organization without knowing what they were doing. And they offered to forego the death penalty. So the ICRC, the Iranian offer was the ICRC would be put in charge of the process. There would be no death penalty to anyone, even to the top elite commanders of the group, and that the majority of them would then be allowed to either come back into Iran or somehow be demobilized, disarmed and demobilized, as the ICRC could help do. And the ICRC had some experience doing this in Algeria. There were ample precedents, and there was division in the Bush administration about whether to accept this. The president, President Bush, thought it was actually a useful idea because his idea was there is no good terrorist organization, and this was a practical way of solving the problem.
And Vice President Cheney thought?
Differently. And that's where we are today, is with a different approach, essentially nothing being done.
Yes, sir. Yeah, right there, it's right here. Thanks, Barry.
It's intriguing you're negotiating, you and Crocker, with Iran. There was an impression, of course, administration fostered, that we're not dealing with Iran. You referred several times now to Al-Qaeda. What did you negotiate? Did you accomplish something? What was Iran willing to do in your behalf, in the U.S.'s behalf?
Great.
Tell us more about that, because that's kind of new, I think. We know Crocker talked to them, but it's more than is generally known. And if you have room for it, did Bill Clinton's administration really need Iranian weapons in Bosnia, or was that just a cover for some other problem solving?
Thank you. I'm going to repeat it because I don't think that mic is on. Will my staff please make sure that the microphone is on? Barry Schweid of AP basically asked the question if you could go into greater detail about your negotiations with the Iranians, with Ryan Crocker over Al-Qaeda. Did they deliver? What was asked? And then secondly, could you reflect upon Bill Clinton and the Bosnian arms issue? Is that fair? Yeah.
Yes, thank you for your question. It is something that doesn't get talked about. I don't really understand why, because there's something interesting and important to say there. Well, I should say I do know why. Essentially, because the Iranians did cooperate and some other countries did cooperate, particularly in the immediate wake of 9/11, with us on Al-Qaeda, that then made it. It would make it, to acknowledge their cooperation would have made it difficult to put them on our target list as being next after Afghanistan, which was the exact debate going on in the administration. But in terms of specifics, in terms of our talks with them about Al-Qaeda, we had a situation in the wake of 9/11 where we were bombing in Afghanistan, and a lot of Al-Qaeda operatives were able to flee. In part because we didn't have a lot of ground troops on the ground. We started off with a very severe, important, and decisive bombing campaign, but we didn't have a lot of troops on the ground. And has been clear with Guantanamo Bay, we didn't really have a process for dealing with people who were going to be picked up, especially in very large numbers. And we had very large numbers of people that were either clearly with al-Qaeda or just were of Arab origin, and we didn't know why else they would be in Afghanistan. Some of these people, a lot of these people, tried to flee to Pakistan. Some tried to flee to the north, to the stands, and some tried to flee to Iran. And what we were able to do with the Iranians was to get the Iranians to try to patrol their border, which they had never really done before. If anybody has followed the kind of narcotics crisis, the cross-border narcotics crisis between Afghanistan and its neighbors, particularly Iran, Iran has a very serious narcotics problem because of the drugs that come in from Afghanistan. They have never been able to patrol that border. It borders on a Sunni, lawless province of Baluchistan inside Iran, where the Iranian government has virtually no control, and where the Rev Guard literally come under fire very frequently. You hear about bombings of Revolutionary Guards on their buses, on their airplanes. They're attacked pretty regularly. The Iranian government has very little control. So our negotiations with the Iranians were about how can they control the border? How can they do that effectively, number one? And one of the things they were able to do was deploy regular troops, in addition to having kind of a Rev Guard presence, to deploy regular troops to the border. These troops then were able to have some actual border crossings and to collect passports, photocopies of passports. So we asked them to, and they did, apprehend people, copy the passports, and they provided those passports. At one point they provided, I recall, 270 passports of Arab individuals that they thought were suspect, and they provided those to, at the time, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, who then passed them to us to see whether any of these people would be of interest to us, and otherwise they were going to try to either keep them out of Iran, period, or to deport them to their countries of origin if they couldn't keep them out. They then went through a process of trying to deport people to their countries of origin. They deported scores of them to Saudi Arabia, to Morocco. They tried to deport to some other countries like Egypt, but Iran doesn't have diplomatic relations with a country like Egypt. So they had a real problem about what to do with some Arab nationals with whom Iran did not have a diplomatic or productive relationship with that government. So there was a whole process, a whole discussion, a whole negotiation about what to do.
Just to clarify, so we asked Iran to guard its borders. What did we give Iran in response? I mean, this is very interesting, and it does. Is this classified for some reason? Is it all public and just nobody knows? I mean,
just people, they don't want to talk about it because to talk about it would acknowledge that Iran actually tried to do something productive.
And so, what did we give Iran?
Let me just say, as a general rule, there's nothing classified in terms of talking to other countries about protecting their borders against terrorists.
Right. So, what was there a quid pro quo element to this? Because if they did move on that, they were. As Flynt has said before, they were focusing their efforts as a way to build towards a normalization process.
They anticipated that their cooperation, particularly on al-Qaeda, particularly after 9/11, would be so important to us, that the impact here of 9/11 was so tremendous in terms of the psychology and the national security for the United States, that their cooperation would be pivotal and allow them to strategically reorient. They were fundamentally mistaken. But that was official after official that I have talked to, that was their understanding, that they would be able to provide this cooperation not as a quid pro quo, and that clearly was told to us as a change in policy. If you recall, during the Clinton administration, after the debacle with Bosnia, and Madeleine Albright tried to do some kind of overtures about pistachios and carpets, that the Iranians said, well, we're not going to just go for pistachios and carpets, we need to have a quid pro quo. They changed their policy, and they said so explicitly, that they were going to help us on al-Qaeda without a quid pro quo, in anticipation that it would be so important to us that they would be able to strategically reorient, and we would be able to see our relationship with them differently.
Go ahead, Barry. Just real quick to Barry, yeah. Is that on? Okay.
A quick follow-up.
Yeah.
I'm a little confused. What is the Afghan? You're talking about passports taken from Arabs and other suspects, I guess, who had crossed the border from Afghanistan into Iran. Right?
Yes, essentially there were thousands, potentially, of Arabs who were fleeing, trying to flee Afghanistan while we were bombing, to try to flee Afghanistan to Pakistan, to Iran, to the stands in the north. They were trying to flee from wherever they could go, and it wasn't actually just Arab men who stereotypically would be
So
categorized
Saudi,
as the soldiers.
Syrians,
And women and
Jordanians,
children. I mean,
women,
there was,
children,
there were these camps, these training camps had whole families. It wasn't just single men. And so the Iranians, like the Pakistanis, were dealing with a fleeing situation. Now, you don't hear about any of this, in particular on the Pakistani side, because I don't think anybody was actually apprehended, put in jail, or deported to their country of origin. But that did happen on the Iranian side. And there were public statements, for example, by the Saudi interior minister at the time, that public statements, not just something in private or low-key, but public statements that the Saudis were receiving 90 people that had been deported from Iran that were of Saudi origin.
Lots of questions. Bob Dreyfus up here and then right next. I'm going to ask for brief questions and even briefer responses. Although you learn so much from Hillary, it's really interesting. Go ahead. Yes, Bob?
Yeah, I'd like to know if you could say a little bit about the political constituency, not among the voters at large, but among the elite and policymakers and others, who gravitates toward this idea. And specifically, I'm thinking of, there's this new Holbrooke-Woolsey United Against Nuclear Iran thing. Maybe you could say a few words about that, because they're trying to ring the alarm bells. And also, the Obama campaign, are they sympathetic to this? And how about in Congress? Besides passing resolutions about Iran,
Okay.
Is there some, responsiveness?
Before Flynt responds, because he wasn't there, New America Foundation hosted an event at the Democratic and Republican National Conventions, the topic of which was facetiously designed to say, can the next American president make the Middle East irrelevant? But in this discussion, both Greg Craig, for the Democratic version, Greg Craig and Senator John Kerry both came out strongly. It was shocking to me with, and it's on public record, the video is out there, for a grand bargain approach. Not only with Iran, but dealing simultaneously with other fundamental factors in the Middle East to actually raise the stakes for Iran. So I deal, Syria, Israel, Palestine, some issues with Pakistan. So I wanted to anticipate Flynt's response, but share that at least Greg Craig and John Kerry, and also Mel Levine, to some degree had half a foot in that direction. Flynt?
Constituencies who are drawn to this, I mean, other than regular readers of the National Interest and Steve's blog, let's see. Look, I mean, we talk with a lot of people on the Hill about this, and I think in private there are a lot of congressmen who can kind of see the logic of this. But they know that Iran is a very dangerous issue in terms of our domestic politics. And so, there aren't that many congressmen who are willing to talk about the need for more robust engagement with Iran. But there are some in the Senate. Certainly, Senator Webb of Virginia, I think, has spoken out pretty forthrightly on this.
I would add Senator Hagel, who's on
yeah.
his way out, but maybe on his way in another capacity,
Yeah.
depending on what happens in a few weeks.
Yeah.
Hagel is also an advocate on the record of this sort of approach.
Senator Feinstein from California has also spoken about the importance of engagement. Yeah. I think that in terms of the Obama campaign, I mean, certainly Senator Obama has said that he wants to pursue, more robust diplomatic engagement with Iran, and has stuck to that. I suspect that how Iran policy would go in an Obama administration, if there is to be one, would depend a lot on, as it always does with the administration, on who gets what jobs.
I think a lot of
what's
folks.
the balance of power among
I think a lot of
various
folks are going to
groups.
find it easy, particularly whoever, whether it's John McCain or Barack Obama, are going to be talking about finding their inner Nixon.
Steve, can I add just one thing briefly
Yeah,
on
very
that?
quickly, because
Very
we've got
briefly.
too many hands.
I think
and
the key
not
thing
enough
here is
time.
a lot of people at this point advocate or are willing to consider engagement, variety of ways to consider engagement. But the critical thing here, and you may find it a little bit, maybe it's too long to read in our piece, is the agenda, is the comprehensive agenda. You may have heard a couple weeks ago, these 5 former Secretary of States, all of them advocated some sort of engagement. We actually heard from one of them. The critical thing is not to sit down and talk. The critical thing is to have an agenda as we've laid out. If you don't have the agenda, you could actually end up talking having the talks aborted as we have in the past and have the situation get even worse.
And the one who contacted you agreed on the agenda being the driver?
Yes, absolutely. He said the critical thing is the agenda.
Democrat or Republican? We know it's male.
It's Republican.
Yeah, Republican male. Interesting. Okay, in the very back, we're going to hop around faster because there's so many of you and so few of me and so little time. The very back, yes. This gentleman right to the right of the camera, yes. And if you'll identify yourself too, I should have been asking.
Newhouse World Security Institute.
The mic is not on, Ben. Can you stop turning it off? Do not turn off the mic anymore, folks. Hold on. Okay.
Do you see or would you envisage a
Can't hear it.
reaction in Iran to the U.S. nuclear deal in the light of occasional warnings?
Sir, I apologize. I cannot, because of the air conditioner,
Okay.
hear you, so I need you to use lungs. That
Do you
is not
see
working.
or would you envisage a reaction in Iran to the U.S. nuclear deal, particularly in the light of occasional warnings from Hu Jintao and other Chinese officials that China will, in the light of such an agreement, put relations with Pakistan on nuclear relations on a similar basis?
Did you hear it? I couldn't hear it.
Basically the impact of the India nuclear deal.
India nuclear deal. So it's India nuclear deal and the impact on that on Iran.
Well, I think clearly if you know China, if a consequence of the U.S.-India nuclear deal were that China did step up strategic cooperation, nuclear cooperation with Pakistan, I mean that would be concerning for Iran, and I think it would be another argument, or at least would bolster long-standing arguments within Iran's national security establishment, why an improved relationship with Washington, why in fact a real strategic understanding with the United States would very much be in Iran's interests.
Right up here at the front. You still have a question?
Well, sure. I don't
Just say it quickly and I'll
yes,
repeat it.
it's
Yeah.
okay. I guess I can say it loudly. My name is Zohar Asghar, Independent Media. Actually, I wanted to expand on the question the gentleman had and the comment that you gave about the cooperation on Iran on different stages and not being, in a way, appreciated or being. Thank you very much. Actually, I just wanted to make a comment that's this is not working. That is very important with the Iranians, and that's not to the advantage of the United States, because the more these cooperations are ignored and the more Iranians are put down, Iranians, I mean people of Iran, in a way, that goes to the advantage of the government of Iran and Ahmadinejad. And that's exactly the same thing about the nuclear energy. When it comes to the national pride, why
Okay,
the
got
others
it.
have it, we
I'm
don't
going to
have it. So
speed
that
things
was
up
a
here.
very good comment.
Question is about national pride not making negotiations or really seeing other concessions in the past as consequential has animated, let's call them the populists.
Yeah, I mean, I think both for the population and the government. You know, you can characterize a government as evil or someone as evil because he makes horrible comments. But the reality is, what we've had are really quashed expectations every time, and so the price goes up each time. And we don't, because the debate in the United States isn't transparent or forthright, we don't really understand that the Iranian expectation, whether it's been Ahmadinejad or Rafsanjani or Khatami, any government leader as well as the population, that those expectations have been quashed, and so the price keeps going up even though the American population doesn't
Great,
realize
fine.
it.
Quick question here.
I wanted to ask about Al Richmond, former State Department, about the tactics from the Iranian side. Was this
Can you ask it very briefly?
Yeah.
I don't need any
was
explanation, it's
this
just a
proposal
question.
deemed in part to affect the composition of the leadership in Iran? Could it be successful with the current leadership?
Thank you. The question is, can the proposal
Yeah.
be successful?
The
with
short
current
answer is yes. It could be successful with the current leadership because it is on core national security issues, ultimately a consensus leadership embodied in the Supreme National Security Council. And within the Supreme National Security Council, it will be the Supreme Leader that has the most significant, not overwhelmingly dominant, but most significant influence. But there is a consensus on this. It's not pay any price for a deal with the United States, but if there is a deal on the table that would meet Iran's interests and Iran can be confident that the U.S. is serious, yes,
I
the
see
current
everybody's
Iranian
hands.
leadership would do this.
I see everybody's hands, don't worry. Right here.
Karen Dolan from the Institute for Policy Studies. And I just wanted you to comment, if you could, on the seeming reversal of the strong saber rattling that we saw recently, let's say in the last 6
Okay,
months or
thank
so,
you.
from the Bush administration, why they've reversed course, and if McCain were to come to power, would he be on that trajectory as well, sort of moving away from that saber rattling and toward your
Thank you.
position?
From the Iranian side, I'll just take that. The Iranians have been shown that they're capable of acting in their national interest. They understand what was going on. They understood what was going on with the Israeli saber rattling as well as the American. They understand that they could actually get a better administration that is not going to seek these kind of ridiculous preconditions, as long as they don't do something very provocative. They've been able to really titrate their provocations, and I think you'll see that continue through the election.
Yeah, I think the two big reasons why Bush backed off were, first of all, the NIE last year, which really took the wind out of the sails. And then I think having Gates replaced by Rumsfeld replaced by Gates at DOD has over time made a significant
I mean, it is
difference.
remarkable that in the last couple of days, I think it's called the American Iranian Council, got permission from the State Department and OFAC to potentially open an office in Iran, which Iran hasn't accepted. But this American Iranian Council is comprised of people like you guys, not comprised of what I would call sort of the WINIP crowd or other. I mean, it's very interesting that was done under this administration. The lady in white, I apologize. Wait for the camera, the microphone.
You have emphasized that Iranian government is ready to consider the international interest. Is there any room for democracy and freedom of the Iranian in that package?
Thank you. Democracy, freedom, agenda.
Let me just say, when we met with one of the founding members of the Revolutionary Guard a couple of years ago, and in the room, actually, were some Israeli academics who thought that this idea, this Grand Bargain idea, which this person, this founding member of the Revolutionary Guard, thought was an important idea, constructive and necessary for Iran. The Israelis and the Iranian government officials agreed. There were a couple of Iranian, I'd say maybe civil society activists in the room. They were petrified. They thought this was going to be the sellout of their human rights of civil society in Iran. There is an element to this where we would be acting in our national security interests, the Iranian government would be acting in its national security interests, and potentially the Israelis would be acting in their national security interests. And I would say, almost like the OSCE process, if you have a robust component that is focused on national security interests, you can potentially also address the human rights concerns, but you include the governments, you don't work against the governments to kind of use it as a stick to hit them over the head with. To me, that's the only way this works. But I think your concern was amplified by the couple of Iranian civil society people in the room. But I would say it's more important to have a stable, productive, constructive relationship between the U.S. and Iran for everybody's human rights than it would be to kind of, what I would say, put on this facade of highlighting a couple of cases here and there and using them to attack the Iranian government.
This gentleman in the middle, and then Mike Miyazawa. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, okay. Matt Cover, CNSnews.com. Given that the Ayatollah has said on many occasions, the Ayatollah Khomeini, that he views that conflict and confrontation with the United States are, in his words, natural and unavoidable, do you think then that a President Obama, and it looks like we're going to have a President Obama, should hold state-level meetings with...
Is,
read
the killer.
Look at the numbers, I guess. But no, or President McCain, I guess, should be holding state-level meetings with Ahmadinejad as part of this grand bargain?
I have to say, this whole conversation about, did Obama really say he was going to meet with President Ahmadinejad and, isn't this terrible or it isn't terrible? I mean, I think this is just such a strategically vacuous way to discuss foreign policy. The point is, what are American interests in this region, arguably the most critical region in the world, and what is going to help advance those interests? And I really do not understand how improving relations, reaching a strategic understanding with Iran is not going to help America's position in this region. And whether this gets, I use the Nixon to China analogy, whether the next president actually ends up going to Tehran, I don't care. Okay? If this ends up all being brokered without head of state meetings, sort of like the rapprochement between the U.S. and Libya was brokered, I think this is still profoundly in U.S. interests. If at some point the next American president decides it will help advance this process for him to meet with his Iranian counterpart, whether it is Ahmadinejad or somebody else, because Iran will have a presidential election next year too, I don't care. That is a kind of low-order tactical question. When the U.S. president and the president of the Islamic Republic of Iran finally meet is a low-order tactical question. What should matter is the strategic question of what kind of relationship we want with Iran and how do we get it.
And if I can just very quickly point out, again, the key is the agenda, is the comprehensive agenda. I know it may be long to read through, but that's what's going to matter. Whether Nixon had to meet with Chairman Mao or Bush had to meet with Colonel Gaddafi, that's not the critical question. The critical question in both the Libya case and in the China case is the comprehensive nature of the agenda and the thoroughgoing strategic rapprochement that was required in both cases.
And I'll guarantee you it won't be two presidents meeting to work that out.
Mike?
Mike Miyazawa. Your argument, as I see it, appears to exclusively focus on the need on the part of the United States to seek that kind of grand bargain so that the United States can achieve its objectives in the region. My question is, do the Iranians feel the similar need? Maybe they can pursue a different path by seeking separate deals with Europeans, the Chinese and Japanese, all of whom are hungry for oil and energy. And that will isolate the United States.
Thank you.
I think it boils down to, in the end, and I've had European negotiators who, when we were kind of outsourcing our nuclear diplomacy to Europeans, I've had European diplomats involved in these talks use this wonderful metaphor that they felt like they were at a cocktail party, they're talking to someone and that person keeps looking over their shoulder to see if someone more important than them has come into the room, because if they have, they're going to break off from this conversation and go over there. I mean, the whole point of the EU3 dialogue from an Iranian perspective was to get the U.S. to the table. The U.S. is the only country that can give Iran a security assurance that means anything. The U.S. is the only country in the world that can really pose a mortal threat to the Islamic Republic of Iran. And yes, Iran can find all kinds of workaround strategies. They're not going to pay any price for a deal with the United States. And they'll find all kinds of workaround strategies to keep themselves going without that. But, in terms of what's optimal for their interests, yeah, there are some things that they really, really want in terms of their interests that they can only get out of a strategic understanding with the United
Mike,
States.
a year or so ago, George Perkovich at the Carnegie Endowment threw a very exciting event together, and I attended. There were about 300 people there, and they had the former ambassador of Iran to the United Nations, named Zarif, Ambassador Zarif, on and talking, and I got to ask a question, and I asked about this so-called negotiations normalization proposal that had come from Iran that so many of our colleagues in town called fake. And so no one had asked the Iranian government, so I cited, was this a fake proposal? And he said, is this off the record? And I can tell you this because the Federal News Service made a transcript and accidentally released it into the press. They took it back, but it was out long enough that lots of people copied it. Thus, he went into great detail as to not only was it not fake, he had written a substantial part of it with full authorization from the top, and went through the rationale at that time for why it was in Iran's interest, regardless of what the U.S. perspective. It was one of the most fascinating eclipses, and I think definitively resolved the question of ownership of that process. Yes, ma'am, right here.
Hi, Jill Perlow.
There's a microphone zipping towards you.
Thank you.
Quick question.
I completely agree with your proposed grand bargain. But I wonder how you would counter the argument that I face often here, that a quick deal with Iran, basically starting with a clean slate on its nuclear noncompliance, would weaken the NPT treaty regime and the UN Security Council. And I just wondered if you could comment on, if you have any ideas about that. And very quickly also, have you seen Iran's offered package of incentives that looks almost exactly like the title and everything, the P5+1s, which you can find on the IAEA's website, and it's a PDF package just like the one that the U.S. And the P5+1 has offered. Thank you.
So NPT and Iran's latest proposal.
Yeah, I have to say I don't really understand this argument, because in the end what we would see as a cardinal element of a grand bargain would be, a diplomatic resolution to the nuclear issue, so that the U.S. and the rest of the international community was comfortable that whatever proliferation risks were associated with Iran's nuclear activities were at an acceptable level. Now, once upon a time, that may have meant, you could have gotten a deal with essentially zero enrichment going on with Iran. I think this is one of the costs of delaying serious diplomacy with Iran. I think those days are gone. I think that whatever deal we're going to get with Iran, there are going to be centrifuges running on Iranian soil. But, the issue is, and I think the Iranians have indicated they'd be prepared to accept really intrusive monitoring, essentially have the IAEA living there 24 hours a day to make sure that the proliferation risks that are attendant on anybody's centrifuges were at an acceptable level. And I don't see how that's going to undermine the NPT. I think what could undermine the NPT is to have Iran expand its fuel cycle infrastructure in a situation in which people don't feel that it is contained within, a legally sanctioned regime. And right now, their compliance with the additional protocol is, as Iranian officials frequently point out, voluntary.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thanks. Mike Pevsner with the Sissy. I just wonder if you could comment on the stability of the Iranian regime and the internal pressures, the demographics, and had gas shortages this year. Thank you.
Yeah, I really don't buy the argument that this is a regime or a society that's in any kind of pre-revolutionary condition. I think that, yes, people, you do have all kinds of evidence of grumbling over economic conditions or various kinds of economic or commercial hardships. This is not new in the history of the Islamic Republic, and I think it's, what it does is it disposes people to go out and vote various ways, and in the elections that Iran holds regularly, it does not predispose people to come out in the streets against the regime. And I don't see any reason to think that Iranian society is going to be in that kind of state anytime in the foreseeable future.
Quick comment, Hillary?
Yeah, two pieces. One, when I was at the White House, we called in every imaginable academic expert on revolutionary societies, trying as hard as possible to find some nugget of truth in the idea that it was somehow a pre-revolutionary society yet again in Iran. We couldn't get one nugget from any of the academics who came in. And this is at the same time, that we were trying to deal with the Iraqis. It was all the same type of thing on intelligence where they were trying to also construct on Iran. Not a single soul would come in and say that they were in a pre-revolutionary state. The other piece is that in terms of some of the kind of gas shortages that you hear all the time or the financial problems you hear all the time, the fact is that the budget today in Iran is still pegged to oil being at a very low price. It's below $40 a barrel in the budget. So what you have is the government, even if Ahmadinejad is challenged because of problems that he's done in terms of handling the economy, he has a slush fund because he's operating at whether oil is at $100 or goes up to $140, it's still more than $40 a barrel, where the budget kind of vacillates a little bit, but it's still pegged to a very low price. So he has a tremendous amount. He, the Revolutionary Guard, have a tremendous amount of essentially slush fund money to consolidate control. So you may continue to see economic problems in the population, but you will, at the same time, I would argue, see greater consolidation, not just of Ahmadinejad, but the Revolutionary Guard over the economy.
And so even if you don't have Ahmadinejad win the election this coming time, you're still going to have a hardliner or a conservative person who's linked to the Revolutionary Guard because their consolidation over the economy continues to grow, essentially because of this slush fund differential.
Interesting. Behind you.
Reinhold Brender from the European Commission Office here in Washington, D.C. What would be the Israeli position vis-à-vis the proposed grand bargain? Would Israel accept it? Would it try to prevent it? Thanks.
Thank you. Israel.
What I find in the Israeli national security establishment, the intelligence community, senior military officers, diplomats, foreign policy professionals in Israel, is that they're actually more realist in their debate on Iran than we are in many respects. If you could get the kind of grand bargain that we're describing, the Israeli national security establishment would be intensely skeptical. They would want to read every detail, not once, not twice, but 3 times to make sure that, things really were being handled. There weren't loopholes that, Hezbollah could drive trucks through. But if you really did have a deal that curbed the nuclear threat and, provided some meaningful relief on the kinds of pressures on Israeli security that Iranian-backed groups put, I think they would accept this. They would be all for it, and I can assure you that the Israeli national security establishment would not ask questions about regime change or even about democratization in Iran. That if you got a deal that really solved core security problems in the region, the Israeli national security establishment would back this. They are skeptical that you can actually do this deal, but if you prove that skepticism wrong, I'm pretty confident they would be all for it.
Interesting.
I think there's a fluidity, though, in Israeli politics right now that's really important. You have Livni was victorious over Mofaz in the Kadima party primaries, which was an important piece, I think, for what Flynt has just outlined, going along with the national security establishment's gut reaction on a deal with Iran. But Mofaz is still a player. And you could end up in elections with Bibi Netanyahu as a real player. And the intersection between, I think, Netanyahu's pursuit of an electoral campaign inside Israel and his pursuit of connections here in the United States could end up being a volatile mix, depending on what happens with Iran, depending on who's president here.
We've seen Netanyahu play realist before, though. I mean, in my view, I sometimes, when I look at Israeli politics, fear Netanyahu less than I do, say, Ehud Barak or Ephraim Snei or others who, on the Labor Party side, are nonetheless very convinced that Iran can't be deterred or seduced or driven in any direction whatsoever. So it is, I would challenge those people who think about Israeli politics not to be on autopilot, given
I
what
agree.
I've heard from both
I think
sides.
the mix that we're going to see over the next 6 to 9 months of a campaign in Israel between Netanyahu and Livni and the campaign here and the transition here, if it's a McCain or Obama administration, that mix needs to be really carefully looked at.
Right. Yes, ma'am.
Michelle Kellerman with National Public Radio. I wondered if you think Secretary Rice and her aides have left anything for the next president to build on in terms of Iran. Do you
Great question.
continue this sort of 3+3 or P5+1, whatever you call it, and build on that, or do you just trash it and start fresh?
Yeah, is there anything at all that, and don't be cynical.
No, I will say, and I hope this doesn't get him in trouble coming from me. But I think that since Bill Burns has come back from Moscow and taken over from Nick Burns as the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, and taking over from Nick, kind of assumed primary responsibility for the Iran portfolio at State. I think you have seen some very positive modifications in the administration's approach to Iran. Just having Bill go to that meeting in Geneva, the kinds of testimony that Bill has given on the Hill about Iran. I think that this administration I think that the chances of this administration doing really, really serious damage beyond what's already been done to U.S. Iranian relations during the next 6 months is pretty small. And so I think if a new president comes in and really wants to take this different kind of strategic agenda with Iran, it will be possible to do so.
Dimitri? Very briefly.
Very quick questions. My question is this. What is your opinion? What's the most close to success on Middle East? Arab Israel conflict or Iran and United States conflict?
Thanks. So the question is, what is more achievable, Arab-Israeli two-state deal or the Grand Bargain with Iran?
I think a deal, an Israel-Syria deal, is actually quite doable if you have a government in Israel that is willing to bite the bullet on full withdrawal from the Golan. I think you can have an Israel-Syria deal in fairly short order. The Israeli-Palestinian track, I am just approaching pretty profound despair. That, you know, I really do wonder if at this point a two-state solution is really still doable, either politically or increasingly just in terms of, you know, facts on the ground. I would love to be proved wrong on that.
We'll prove you wrong.
But please do. But I am kind of despairing of that. In contrast to the Palestinian issue, I think that U.S. Iranian rapprochement is harder to do than Israeli-Syrian peace, but it is actually doable in ways that, you know, I begin to wonder if a two-state Israeli-Palestinian outcome is really still in the cards.
Yes, this gentleman here, and we got to close. I apologize.
Mark Johnson from FOR. Week before last, we hosted a meeting of 150 peace movement people with Ahmadinejad, Mataki, and Karzai in New York. Is there any place in this grand bargain for civil society on both sides of the equation to advance the agenda?
No.
Well, you know, I think the critical thing is the agenda. And there was a similar initiative done called the Geneva Initiative that Daniel Levy, if he's here, was a critical part of. Which was very important. It essentially put together a substantive agenda for Arab-Israeli peace, for Palestinian-Israeli peace, and tried to get signatories across the Israeli-Arab divide. I think it's an important thing if it can be achieved. The most important thing, though, is the substance, and then having the political will in governments to implement the substance. If there's popular support, that's great, but I don't see it as we didn't have success on the Geneva Initiative. I don't think it actually would put it over the top. Here, what we need is political leadership, political will to implement what is a substantive agenda.
Yeah, I did go back to the Nixon to China analogy. I don't think civil society played that much of a role in the opening to China, and I have a feeling that will probably be the pattern here. It's going to be, you know, statesmen deciding to act like statesmen and make history.
I do think, where I think the times have changed, I'm going to editorialize as we close and thank Flynt and Hillary. I think the role for civil society is setting a bar of expectation for what they expect about deal making and the degree to which they see sort of pathways to sort of a more stable or different order, begin thinking 30, 40 years out what the world needs to look like and how you begin doing it. I think that needs to begin happening through civil society institutions and as much engagement as we can muster on some of these things. The problem is, I also agree with Flynt, this deal, if you get a grand deal with bargain, I mean, I want to facetiously ask, are they really sure it's not happening right now? Because it's often the most unlikely times with the worst kind of rhetoric. This gentleman who asked about Ahmadinejad's, comments or other Motaki's comments about, never-ending crisis, that they may be behind the scenes cooking a deal up. Recently, we had Brent Scowcroft and Zbig Brzezinski here for a book called America in the World, which New America helped sponsor. And I was talking to them about, talking about this, and Brzezinski said, Steve, why, if we were going to go down this path, say, i.e. dealing with Iran, why would we talk about it? In other words, there is the issue of, if this gets hatched, it will most likely be hatched because of large tectonic pressures and the need to move. We'll wake up one day and hear of some revolutionary deal, some huge moment. But I do think, and I disagree with you, I do think civil society can play an important role in terms of laying out expectations, of promoting engagement, talking, as I did with the Ambassador Zarif. I mean, there is a change, there's a demand for a different kind of agenda that I think is very important in civil society as I see it. But I don't think this will be negotiated in public. I want to thank Hillary Mann Leverett and Flynt Leverett for an outstanding program. I want to thank the Washington Monthly. Get the Washington Monthly, go to the website, watch the video, and read other great articles by Jonathan Alter, Wes Clark, Kevin Drum, Jim Fallows, Greg Easterbrook, and more. Thank you very much.